They had been watching you. Not the way clumsy detectives trail a suspect in bad films. No, this was precise, methodical, invisible. For months, they studied your rhythms, the way you typed, the searches you abandoned, the nights you spent staring at the ceiling instead of the screen. They noted when your movements changed, when your eyes lost their flicker of distraction. You were slipping out of sync. And then it happened. You stopped feeding the machine. You became an irregularity in a system designed to thrive on chaos. Because the world doesn't fear destruction, it fears what it can't predict. And you were no longer predictable. You began doing strange things. You read until your vision blurred. You deleted the apps that kept you docile. You ignored the traps, likes, swipes, notifications, walking past them like they were roadkill. You weren't supposed to do that. You were supposed to consume, to react, to stay in rhythm. But you broke it. And that's when your name surfaced in places you'll never see. No one said it outright, but the message was clear. You were a threat. Not because you carried a weapon, not because you whispered secrets, but because you stopped obeying, because you saw the wires, and worst of all, you stopped dancing. In a world addicted to noise, silence is sabotage. When a man no longer hungers for approval, when his eyes stop darting for validation, when his mind goes still as a predator before the strike, that's when the watchers take notice. A man who isn't distracted is dangerous. A man who thinks is volatile. A man who questions is radioactive. They called it behavioral deviation. What it really meant was, you remembered who you were before they rewired you. They trained you young, slow, sugar in your milk, heroes on your screen, noise in your skull. They gave you a script: school, job, debt, scream, sleep, repeat. They taught you to chase ghosts. But then, you stopped. You stood still. You looked at the stage, and instead of applauding, you asked why. That's when the alarm sounded. A human being, fully awake, is a glitch in their system, someone unafraid of solitude, someone who doesn't beg for entertainment, someone who stares into the void and doesn't blink. That kind of man can't be forecast, can't be packaged, can't be sold. They tracked your screen time. It plummeted. Your consumption dwindled. Your mind started creating instead of chewing. You weren't scrolling. You were dissecting. You weren't buying. You were building. Your thoughts no longer followed the script. You questioned the trends, challenged the dogmas, asked why weakness was glamorized and mediocrity rewarded. And when you refused to laugh with the crowd, they flagged you. Because obedience is the currency of this age. Not money, not status, obedience, silent compliance. The moment you step out of line, even slightly, you're suspect. You weren't supposed to wake up. Yet here you are. You walked past the dopamine hooks, past the clickbait, past the influencers selling emptiness. You didn't hunt for shortcuts. You hunted for war. You embraced suffering like a man who knows pain is the toll to power. That's when they labeled you, not a threat to society, a threat to the system, the framework that keeps men numb. You started taking cold showers, eating like an adult, journaling your demons, studying psychology, watching your own mind like a scientist. You saw your fear, your greed, your envy, and instead of running, you dissected them. You learned how men are manipulated, and then you resisted. You killed the music, sat in silence, faced the voices in your skull. Most people beg for distraction. You sat in the dark and picked at your wounds. Why am I like this? Who made me this way? Who profits from my weakness? The system shuddered. They weren't scared of your anger. They were scared of your focus, your calm, your precision, because rage is noisy, predictable. But clarity is fatal. You woke early, slept less, complained less, ate clean, moved with purpose. Your phone became a tool, not a pacifier. Your room became a temple, not a landfill. You spoke less, observed more. And when they mocked your discipline, you didn't flinch. You'd become sovereign. That word alone, sovereignty, is quietly forbidden. They want you hungry, confused, always reaching, never full. But you had nothing to prove. You weren't begging for love in pixels. You weren't mining meaning from memes. You were building something ancient, something outlawed, self-ownership. And when the machine couldn't guess your next move, they knew you were slipping free. Freedom is treason in a kingdom of control. You weren't rioting, you weren't screaming, you were simply stepping off the ride, unsubscribing, logging out, and they branded you with one word: threat. You sought truth, not trends, depth, not dopamine. You walked toward discomfort, killed the noise, wore solitude like armor. You didn't chase women, you chased mastery. Didn't hunt motivation, you built momentum. You became a storm, not the kind that wrecks cities, the kind that wakes the dead. You saw the ugly truth. Most people are living scripts they didn't write, chasing desires they didn't choose, spouting opinions they didn't test. But you weren't most people anymore. You looked in the mirror and didn't see a face. You saw a question. That's when everything shifted. The notifications stopped. The world went quiet. But it wasn't peace. It was surveillance. They weren't ignoring you. They were dissecting you. Because when a man grows silent, but his gaze sharpens, they know he's constructing something. Not an empire, a revolt. And the terrifying part? It starts in his mind. But revolutions don't stay hidden. Not in a world where even your heartbeat is data. So when you move against the grain, not with shouts, but with silence, you trigger something primal. You enter a war you never enlisted in. A war fought not with bullets, but with beliefs. Not with blood, but programming. And you stepped onto the battlefield unarmed because no one told you it was war. But look closer. Everything is weaponized. Language, pleasure, comfort, even kindness. The most lethal traps don't look dangerous. They look convenient. Every swipe, every ping, every artificial grin. They're not just distractions. They're muzzles. They tried to make you forget. Not just facts, instincts. The instinct to resist, to fight, to guard your thoughts like territory. But you remembered. You started treating your mind like a fortress. You questioned anything that came too easy, peered behind every curtain. You didn't just reject the lies, you autopsied them. They call it paranoia. You know what it really is? Pattern recognition. It's what happens when your senses reboot. When the static fades, and you start hearing the gears behind the curtain they call reality. You saw how every choice was pre-designed. The food, the dreams, the enemies. Even your rebellions were pre-packaged. But you burned the script. You stopped regurgitating their narratives. Your opinions weren't hand-me-downs anymore. You forged them, jagged and imperfect, but yours. And in a world where originality is heresy, that made you dangerous. Because a free mind is a mirror, and no one likes what it reflects. You stopped debating. You observed. You realized truth doesn't yell. It waits. You quit feeding arguments meant to drain you. Stopped explaining yourself to programmed minds. You walked away, not in defeat, but in domination. Because a conscious man's silence isn't emptiness, it's artillery. That's when they escalated. The manipulation grew subtler. They didn't attack. They seduced, offered validation, luxury, voices that pretended to free you while chaining your thoughts. You weren't being shackled. You were being comforted into surrender. But you kept moving. You trained your body, not for vanity, for rebellion. Every push-up was defiance. Every fast was independence. Every controlled breath was reclaiming your machinery. You weren't sculpting a statue. You were forging a weapon. The change wasn't just skin deep. It was cellular. The kind that alters your frequency. People felt it. Some recoiled. Others got angry. The system wants you likable, not formidable. You were becoming the latter. Even those close to you bristled at your evolution. You weren't digestible anymore. That's what happens when a man lives by principle, not impulse. When he stops bargaining his values for belonging. When he stands straight in crooked rooms. And when you refuse to kneel, they didn't confront you. They tried to erase you. Because your existence was condemnation enough. You began influencing without trying, without followers, without a platform, just by being, by making discipline look effortless, clarity look lethal. You didn't inspire with speeches, you infected with presence. And those still plugged in. They felt it like a fever with no name. So the system retaliated, not with force, but flood. More content, more trends, more noise. Not to convert you, to exhaust you. Because most rebellions die not by opposition, but fatigue. But you were ready. You'd built endurance, not just of muscle, but of mind. Learned to guard your attention like gold. To retreat into silence without feeling lost. You weren't hiding. You were reloading. Then you saw it. The next layer. How fear was repackaged as virtue. How guilt became a leash. How division was manufactured. Same poison, different flavors. You didn't pick sides. You studied the source. And once again, they couldn't categorize you. Because nothing terrifies a controlled system more than a man who won't play. You weren't driven by rage, by design, not seeking destruction, building something new, brick by brick, decision by decision. Your life became your manifesto, not loud, not branded, just real. And in this factory of illusions, reality is treason. You found others, not many, just a few. Men and women who carried the same quiet fire, who didn't fit, didn't scroll, didn't speak unless it mattered. You didn't form a tribe, you formed a signal. A resistance without slogans, without banners, just standards. And then, the most dangerous thing happened. You began imagining a world beyond their design, not a utopia, just a place where truth wasn't filtered, where strength wasn't shamed, where humans weren't data. And that vision, even unspoken, was the ultimate threat. Because every empire fears imagination, you didn't need to riot, to destroy. You just needed to exist, day after day, without bending, without dissolving. Your rebellion wasn't loud, it was relentless, and that triggered their endgame. Now they'll send emissaries, not with badges, but smiles, with ideas that feel like truth. They'll invite you to soften, to return, to belong. What they're really offering is anesthesia, because raw consciousness hurts in their world. You've come too far to stop now. But understand, the next phase is colder. You'll face yourself in darker mirrors, walk mazes built from your own desires. This isn't about the system anymore. It's about whether you can lead without applause, whether you can stand alone without resentment, whether you can stay awake when no one's watching. That's the final exam, and it's already begun. You'll feel it soon, not as fear, but friction. A restlessness that isn't fatigue, but evolution. The kind of pressure that doesn't crush, it carves. And in that carving, you'll face a question no algorithm can answer. Who are you when the only enemy left is the one inside? When the adversary wears no uniform but hides in your thoughts, disguised as hesitation, as comfort, as the whisper that says, wait, just a little longer. This is where most vanish, not by defeat, by delay. Because the final trap isn't resistance, it's stillness. A slow, silent death that feels like peace but rots you from within. This is the crucible, where illusions burn away, where you meet the parts of yourself that once protected you, the need to be liked, the hunger for safety, the addiction to approval. They served you once, now they must die. Not violently, voluntarily. You'll have to choose again and again to shed skins that no longer fit. That's the agony of growth, burying versions of yourself you once called home. You'll see, freedom isn't just breaking chains. It's walking past open cages without entering. Every desire is a test, every temptation a mirror, not of what you want, but what still owns you. The world will still dangle rewards, applause, shortcuts. But you can't unsee the strings, so you detach. Not in anger, in awareness. You stop chasing echoes, stop feeding noise, start moving by inner compass, even when the path vanishes. Because now you navigate by code. A code that doesn't bend, even when everything else does. That code becomes your anchor, not to hold you down, to keep you upright when the storm returns. And it will. Not as chaos, as whispers, in relationships, in the tension between who you were and who you're becoming, in the weight of your own silence. But you'll feel something else too. A new stillness, the kind that doesn't beg for distraction. That's where power begins. Not power over others, over yourself. You'll speak less, but your words will land harder. You'll read rooms faster, not to manipulate, but to measure truth. You'll realize most people aren't speaking. They're bleeding, begging to be heard, even if they don't know why. But you've been silent too long to play that game. Your quiet isn't passive anymore. It's potent. You enter spaces now with presence, not noise. And the room adjusts. That's what they fear. Not the screamers, not the sign wavers. The ones who went silent by choice, who mastered restraint, who sharpened themselves into something deadlier than anger. Clarity. Because clarity doesn't argue. It cuts. And the system has no counter for that. But clarity demands a price. You lose the right to pretend. You can't unsee the patterns, can't shrink back into ignorance, can't join the herd without feeling the weight of your own betrayal. You become allergic to shallowness, to empty rituals, to synthetic emotion, and in that refusal, you become alien. You weren't made to blend in. You were forged in friction, tempered by isolation, designed to transmit a frequency that scrambles the programming in others. Your existence forces a choice, evolve or retreat. There is no neutral. You've become a tuning fork for truth, and not everyone can handle the vibration. But you didn't come here to be understood. You came to build, to create what doesn't yet exist, to lay foundations in a world corrupted by comfort. You channel the chaos, turn pain into fuel, loneliness into leverage. You become architecture made flesh, proof of everything they said was impossible. And now, they're watching. The ones who mocked your silence, who called your intensity obsession, they sense it. You've crossed a line they can't follow. You didn't just change habits. You rewired your soul. You became sovereign. And sovereignty isn't loud. It's lethal. Because a sovereign man is untamable. He doesn't need their systems, their validations, their labels. He doesn't react, he responds, doesn't argue, acts, doesn't cling, releases, and that terrifies them. Because control only works on those still starving for approval. You feast on solitude now, on fire, on focus. You're not angry, you're awake, and you know the final secret. The real war was never out there, it was inside. The enemy wasn't a politician, a corporation, an ideology. It was the voice in your skull that said you were small, that insisted you obey, that told you to want less, be less, feel less. You strangled that voice, not with words, with action. You became what they said you couldn't, endured what was meant to break you, rebuilt your mind brick by bloody brick, until it became unshakable. And now you don't need to be told you're dangerous, you know. You're the anomaly they can't model, the variable they can't predict, the glitch they can't patch. You left the simulation, not with a roar, with a step. And now that you're out, you see it all. How deep the programming runs, how afraid they are of stillness, how allergic to silence. Because in silence, truth echoes, and in truth, there is no control, only choice you made yours, long ago, quietly, irrevocably, and now you walk alone. Not in exile, in ascension, no flags, no anthems, no uniforms, just presence, just fire. Just eyes that no longer blink at lies. You're not waiting for a sign. You are the sign, not searching for the way. You are the way, not asking permission. You're the proof, and they know it. That's why they buried your name in code, why they track your shadow, not because you're violent, not because you're loud, but because you became what they fear most, a man who opened his eyes